socioeconomic conditions in Egypt in the past 60 years. And these conditions have driven the people to take to the streets. They have helped bring Egyptians together because of several reasons. I will finish this part and then I will stop and take some questions. But first, let me talk about three major historical periods. The 1950s and 60s. This was the age of revolution and socialism, headed, of course, by Nasser. Now, this period in Egyptian history was a period where people were brought together because of this project of reform, a new project for reform, for modernization, for making Egypt a great country, for pan-Arabism, okay? And, of course, for extreme socialism, as opposed to what used to be there with the time of the royal family. Now, when the revolution happened, 1952 revolution happened, first, people hailed it as a great period of change, and everybody was accepting that. But with this major project for reform, with this new trend, with pan-Arabism, with modernity, with socialism, also came the police state, okay? There was this heavy hand of the state, and Egypt was eventually turned into a totalitarian regime under Nasser. Okay, what happened was that with this, something very interesting happened to the Egyptian population. Now, first of all, economically, there was control of the state over everything. Education, healthcare, employment opportunities, major industries. Now, with this control of the state, something happened to the people. The individual spirit was crushed, okay? And gradually, Egyptians started depending on the state for everything. For education, for healthcare, for employment. And so, any entrepreneurial desires were killed. No efforts in that direction were made. And so, the state was the be-all and end-all. And it was a police state as well. Also, one other thing that happened during the time of Nasser in the 50s and 60s was the dwindling of the middle class in Egypt. The dwindling of the middle class happened because of several reasons. But one major reason for that was the quote-unquote brain drain that started to happen. A lot of intellectuals and professionals left Egypt in the late 60s and the early 70s, and they just left Egypt because they wanted better employment opportunities, better work conditions, and more freedom. And so the brain drain that took place affected the middle class in Egypt. Following that, we have the death of Nasser and the accession of Sadat. So we said in the period of Nasser, we had a reform project, extreme socialism, a totalitarian state, a police state, of course, and the migration of the intellectuals and professionals, and the total dependence of the individuals on the state. And then came Sadat. And with Sadat, we have what was known as the openness policy, in which he tried, after attempting to solve the Arab-Israeli problem by at least securing the borders of Egypt with the Camp David Peace Treaty, he started introducing what was known as the openness policy, in which he would allow private investment and gradually, in an attempt to gradually move the country into a market economy. Now, the result was the following. Although he was pushing for that, the state still controlled the major industries, education, and healthcare. Okay? So the individuals, the majority of the Egyptian population still depended on the state. And at the same time, the open market policy created more consumerism, okay? And therefore led to a wider gap between the haves and have-nots. In other words, we have an economic gap here that started happening. Simultaneously, something else happened, because when people could not find employment opportunities, or when their living conditions were not as they wanted them to be, what happened was that they started migrating again. But this time for employment, okay, and not for, because they needed food. They needed to make a better living. And so a lot of them moved east to the Gulf oil states in search for employment opportunities. Now, when they moved east, okay, they found employment opportunities, but two things happened as a result. A, more discrepancy among the income of Egyptians, because the people who went to the Gulf paid more money, and they came back with more money, and the people who stayed had less money, and so the gap started widening. But also, a greater migration from the rural areas to the cities, because the people who went to the Gulf states made enough money to come and buy inside the cities and forget about the other parts of the country. So we have, you know, a denser population inside the cities, more discrepancy in income, but more importantly, and that is again my personal perspective, is the fact that there has been a change of culture with this type of migration east. And that is the fact that the people who went east and came back to Egypt, or came in the summer and went back again in the winter to continue their employment or whatever, they brought with them a new culture. And the new culture they brought with them is characterized by a little bit of an extremist kind of Islam. And that is what I call Wahhabi Islam. They brought this to Egypt. And so it started manifesting itself in the dress code, a more conservative Islamic perspective, a narrower view of things. And so over the years, the culture began to change in Egypt. That is, after this period of the 1970s and early 80s. 1980s to 2011, this is when the aggressive capitalist economy took over in Egypt. Now with the advent of Mubarak, who continued the openness policy, we find more foreign investment, Egypt moving towards a market economy, and the area of the age of globalization taking on in the country. But at the same time, the state still does until now control education, healthcare, okay, and all the major industries. With this era, we had a sharp deterioration in education and healthcare. Really a decline that is terrible, that's in the past 30 years. We have extreme corruption, ineffective governance, increased police brutality, and a horrible rise in prices of commodities. And therefore, what is happening here, or what has been happening over the past 30 years, is the fact that the market economy, okay, extreme capitalism has been affecting the lives of people. And at the same time, many people in Egypt depend entirely on government for employment, etc. And government income will not help them make ends meet. And so the sense of frustration was growing. Okay? And something also important was happening, and that is corruption on every level. And I will take the political scene as an example. Now, these years showed us an increase in the power of the NDP, which is the National Democratic Party, headed by President Mubarak at the time, and which was the dominant party on the political scene. So this was a party where everybody had to listen to because it's a single party, okay? And at the same time, allowing other parties to exist was there. But all the other parties, as the Egyptians used to call them, are they used the term cartoon parties. They were just parties, okay? And they have, a president, and they have people in the party, and an ideology and all that, but they are so ineffective, okay? And also the unions, professional unions, trade unions, etc. Most of the elections are rigged in favor of members of the NDP. And these people did not have the power. They were really ineffective because they don't have the power to check the performance of the central government, because they're not really a properly elected body. So the political arena was dominated by the NDP, hardly any democratic process there, and things got worse when, after the 2005 elections, when it became very obvious to everyone that the president was planning to hand over the reins to his own son at the time. And so this was frustrating to a lot of people. So that's politically. And as I said, in education and healthcare, it was terrible. And the Egyptian society was sort of torn or divided, in the sense that you have the people who have the income, the people who enjoy the benefits of the free market economy, who live in gated communities, and who are enjoying their lives, and the people who have absolutely nothing, who are living under very dire living conditions, poor health care, poor sanitation, and who cannot, make ends meet. They cannot live on a day-to-day basis. So again, everything was touching people's livelihood, people's lives. Until finally, in 2010, the brazen-faced rigging of the 2010 parliamentary elections was too much for people to handle. They had had enough of that. Immediately, that was followed by the bombing of a Qudsiyin church in Alexandria on New Year's Eve. And that really aggravated people more. It shook Egyptian society no end. And people were they had enough. Enough of sectarian strife, because this led to sectarian strife. Enough of poverty, enough of rigging elections, enough of political corruption. They had enough. So this was like the spark. And so the people, took to the streets chanting bread, freedom, social equity, and human dignity. Of course, because, and the fact that it started on the 25th of January was because this is the official police day. So every year, the 25th of January is the day when they celebrate police force in Egypt. So the young people decided that this was the right time to start. And instead of going out for a celebration, they decided to spoil it for the state. And so they took the streets. Of course, I will stop here before I talk about the revolution very briefly, and ask you to perhaps discuss things, ask questions, or... Yes?
Two questions. How was that Sadat became the next president, and why, and how did that happen? And also, you can talk about his assassination. You say something.
Okay. Sure. Okay. How did Sadat become president? You see, again, in a police state. For the past 60 years, Egypt has been a police state. It is ruled by the military. And after Nasser, after the 1952 revolution, Nasser became president. He was a dictator, in spite of the fact that he has strong points, but he was a dictator. And then, before he died, I think it was a year or 2 years before he died, he nominated the vice president. And so the vice president was Anwar Sadat. Now, when Nasser passed away, they had a referendum. This is how things were done. They put something to a referendum. And the referendum results are always 98, 99%. Okay? In spite of the fact that, I mean, this was always has been a charade. People don't go. First time we have people going to the polls is this year. Very few people ever went to cast a vote or to say A or nay in a referendum. So this is how Sadat became president. His assassination came as a result of two things. First, the inability of people to accept, a lot of people to accept the peace treaty with Israel. Okay? Whether we agree with it or disagree with it, this is not a good enough reason to kill somebody. But anyway, so this was the salient move. People did not accept the peace treaty with Israel. And the second thing is that right before he died, he had decided to crush dissent. And to crush dissent as in nobody's going to open their mouths for now. And later on, we discovered that he had had this plan to do that very briefly and then take the people out of prison and, move into whatever, a democratic transition or whatever. But what he did immediately before his assassination was put everyone in prison. The Islamists, the communists, the Pope, the Egyptian Pope, a lot of writers, okay, he just locked them up, okay? And the people who killed him, people who assassinated Sadat, were not among the intellectuals, they were the extremist Islamists who were actually, some of them are, who just left prison a few months ago, and those people were a group of very extreme right-wing Islamists under the leadership of Omar Abdurrahman, who is locked up in the US. And those people believed that Sadat was a traitor, an evil man, and he has to go. And so they killed him on the day when, on the celebration of the 6th of October war, in the middle of the parade, in the heart of the army. The person who shot him had taken the several medals as the best sniper in the army. And he belonged to this extremist